3 true and terrifying horror stories about trains. Imagine yourself alone at night, on an empty train, only the sound of the wheels on the tracks breaking the silence. What would you do if you started to feel like you were no longer alone? And what if, suddenly, the shadows around you began to come to life, and an invisible presence drew closer? Would you really know what is real? Today, we're going to explore 3 true and terrifying horror stories about trains that challenge your perception of safety and reality. Stories that deal with the most primal fear, the fear of the unknown, of confinement, and of darkness. Have you ever wondered what would happen if your train journey turned into an endless nightmare? These stories aren't just about ghosts or monsters. They're about the psychological terror of being trapped, where escape is an illusion and the tension grows with every passing second. Could you withstand the pressure of being in an enclosed space, not knowing who's really by your side, or who or what might be waiting for you in the shadows? Confinement situations can leave us vulnerable, especially at night when the line between the real and the imaginary begins to blur. Have you ever thought about how your mind can create horrors in a place where you can't escape? And what if that place was a moving train, far from any help? Prepare to feel the chill of uncertainty and the growing fear as we uncover the stories of passengers who found themselves in situations no human should ever experience. This video will explore the darkest corners of your mind and the fear of being trapped with no visible way out. Stay until the end, as each story will leave you more tense, more immersed, and more questioning. What would you do if you were trapped, with no one around to hear your screams? Let's begin. Story 1. The Train of the Forgotten. Sam was a photographer with a penchant for exploring the forgotten corners of the world. Today, he stood at the entrance of an old, abandoned railway that cut through the heart of the dense Blackwood forest. The path was overgrown, swallowed by thick vines and the heavy scent of damp earth. Stories had long circulated about this place. Tales of eerie whispers and the sound of a ghostly train that roamed the tracks late at night. As Sam adjusted the strap of his old camera, a chill ran down his spine. His grandfather, a conductor who had mysteriously vanished decades ago, once spoke of this railway before disappearing. That childhood memory, a blend of wonder and dread, was what brought Sam here. He was determined to capture the soul of this haunted place, if only for the flickering proof of a camera lens. The air was still, but heavy with an expectation that made the forest feel alive. Sam took a few steps onto the old track, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant call of a crow. He glanced up at the tangle of trees and brambles that arched overhead like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, he felt watched. The sensation prickled at the back of his neck, making him pause and look over his shoulder. But the path behind him was as silent and empty as before, save for the whisper of wind rustling through the leaves. Sam shook off the unsettling feeling, chalking it up to nerves. He raised his camera and began snapping shots of the ancient decaying rails that stretched into the dense forest like veins. The first few photos turned out as expected, capturing the gnarled wood and rusted metal. But when he checked the next set, his heart skipped a beat. There, in one of the photos, a faint silhouette stood among the trees, a figure that hadn't been there moments before. He squinted at the image, fingers trembling slightly, then scanned the forest around him. No movement, just the oppressive silence and the thick shadows that seemed to watch back. A sudden metallic screech echoed from deeper in the woods, the sound so sharp and jarring that Sam almost dropped his camera. It was as if an old train wheel had turned, crying out after years of disuse. He laughed nervously, convincing himself it was a bird or an animal scraping against metal. Yet the noise had carried a resonance, a weight that spoke of something more. The whisper of wind shifted, carrying with it a sound he couldn't ignore, a distant, mournful whistle. Low and haunting, it made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Sam's pulse quickened as the eerie whistle faded into the silence of the forest. He took a shaky breath and aimed his flashlight down the length of the track, its beam slicing through the thickening mist that had started to creep in from all sides. The fog clung to the ground, wrapping around his ankles like cold, ghostly fingers. The air grew heavier, and then he heard it. Soft at first, almost like the wind. It wasn't until the sound grew louder that he realized it was a chorus of voices. Whispers, fragmented and layered, as though dozens of unseen figures surrounded him, speaking just out of earshot. He froze, his breath caught in his chest. The voices carried hints of laughter and sobs, mixing in a haunting cacophony that made him feel like he was intruding on something sacred and mournful. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice trembling. Silence. The whispers stopped, and the sudden quiet was suffocating. He spun around, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, shrouded in its oppressive blanket of mist. He adjusted his flashlight, and it flickered, casting shadows that danced along the undergrowth. He swallowed hard, a tight knot of fear forming in his stomach. The stories had always seemed like folklore, tales to spook children. But now, standing there, surrounded by that heavy, watchful quiet, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. A low, metallic groan sounded behind him. The cold grip of dread settled over him as he turned slowly, eyes wide. Sam's eyes widened as he turned to face the sound. Through the shrouded mist, he saw it, a hulking silhouette of iron and rust emerging from the darkness. It moved without the rumble of an engine, gliding forward as if guided by an unseen force. The abandoned train, corroded and overgrown with moss, looked like it had been pulled straight from the stories of the Blackwood Forest. The windows were cracked and clouded, but behind the fractured glass, Sam saw faces, pale, lifeless faces that stared back at him with hollow eyes. Each one was frozen in an expression of longing and despair, and they seemed to follow his every move. His breath caught in his throat as a cold chill ran through his body. Among them, a familiar face stood out. It was older and more worn than he remembered, but there was no mistaking it. The grey eyes and solemn mouth belonged to his grandfather. "Grandpa," Sam whispered, taking a step closer. His voice was swallowed by the silence as the train slowed, stopping just feet away from him. A thin veil of mist swirled around the wheels, giving the illusion that the ground itself was alive. Suddenly, one of the figures in the window pressed a hand against the glass. It was Sam's grandfather. His eyes, filled with an unknowable sadness, met Sam's, and a barely perceptible shake of his head sent a shiver down Sam's spine. It was a warning. Before Sam could react, the train's whistle shrieked, loud and piercing, filling the air with a sound that vibrated through his bones. The fog thickened, wrapping around him and making it impossible to see anything but the train's haunting silhouette. Panic surged in his chest as he stumbled back, the voices rising once more, louder and more insistent. Sam's heart pounded as he tried to process what he was seeing. The figures in the train, including his grandfather, seemed trapped, their hands pressing harder against the glass, mouths forming silent words that he couldn't hear but could feel in the pit of his stomach. The whispers around him turned into desperate pleas, rising in a chilling crescendo that made his head spin. He needed to move. The train's whistle blared again, echoing through the trees and shaking him from his paralysis. Sam turned and bolted down the track, the mist clawing at him with icy tendrils. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest were trying to pull him back toward the ghostly train. The sound of metal grinding and the low rumble of unseen wheels followed him, closing in faster than he could run. He stumbled, falling to the ground and scraping his palms on the rough wooden planks. For a moment, darkness threatened to swallow him whole, and he squeezed his eyes shut, willing the nightmare to end. The voices dimmed, replaced by the deafening silence of the forest. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself at the edge of the woods, gasping for air. The mist had receded, leaving only the faint, haunting echo of the train's whistle in the distance. Sam's limbs trembled as he pushed himself up, heart still racing with the memory of those hollow eyes and the silent warning they held. Back home, Sam sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at his battered camera on the table. The memory of the train and the faces, especially his grandfather's, played over and over in his mind, a loop he couldn't escape. He tried telling his friends about the encounter, but they only exchanged skeptical glances, assuming it was just another one of his wild stories born from urban exploration. Sleep came in brief, restless bursts, each one punctuated by nightmares of fog and whispers. The whistle's mournful sound would pierce through the quiet of the night, echoing in his ears even when he was awake. He questioned whether he had truly seen the train, or if it had been a vivid hallucination fueled by old legends. But deep down, Sam knew it was real. The photograph that haunted him most was the one his camera had managed to capture, a shadowed figure with hollow eyes. Weeks later, Sam received a call from his friend Adam, who had been helping him research the railway. Adam mentioned that he had come across something odd, a photograph online shared by someone who had ventured into the forest years ago. Sam's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. A blurry image of himself standing by the tracks, his eyes wide with shock. But there, in the window of the ghostly train, was the unmistakable face of his grandfather, watching him. The sound of a train's whistle echoed in the distance, sharp and cold, as Sam's blood ran cold. Story 2. The Tragedy of Katoen Station. Jim Callahan hadn't seen Katoen Station in over 20 years. The small rural station had always been a place of work, a pit stop for the freight trains he'd operated back in his younger years as a railroad engineer. It wasn't until he retired that the weight of the place really started to settle on him, an unshakable sense of unfinished business. The station, like his memories of it, was run down now, the station house barely standing and the platforms cracked with age. The wind kicked up dust around the rusted tracks, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the air. Jim had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers of something sinister tied to Katoen's history. But he had never really believed them, not until now. At 58, Jim wasn't a young man anymore. His hair had turned gray, and his back creaked whenever he stood too long. But he'd never thought of Katoen Station as anything other than a relic of his past. That was until the day he received a letter with a faded, nearly illegible return address. The letter didn't say much, just that there was something he needed to see before it was too late. The rest of the words were smudged with time. That was the letter that brought him back. He stepped off the bus that had dropped him near the station, the old dirt road leading up to it familiar but somehow distorted by the years. As he approached, a sense of unease settled in his stomach. He hadn't expected the place to feel so alive. There were no people here, no passengers waiting for trains, no workers bustling about. Yet the echoes of something, some memory, some voice, lingered in the air. The chill of the wind cut through Jim's jacket as he made his way to the platform. The tracks lay still, but Jim could swear he heard the faintest hum, like the distant sound of a train's whistle. He stopped. It was impossible. No train had passed through Katoen in years. He shook his head. "Get a grip, Jim," he muttered to himself. The wind rattled the loose boards of the old station house as if the place was breathing, welcoming him back in a way he didn't understand. The station was silent again, save for the low hum of wind through the broken windows. Jim swallowed and took a step closer to the platform's edge. It was then that he noticed it. A photo stuck to the crumbling wall of the station house. Faded and worn by time, it showed a group of railroad workers, most of them wearing the same uniforms Jim had once worn. And there, standing among them, was Charlie. Jim's breath caught. Charlie, his old friend who he had lost that day, the day the accident happened. Jim had always thought Charlie was working a different route that day, that he hadn't been on the train that derailed. But here, in this photo, Charlie was standing right there, smiling in the sunlight with the rest of the crew. He stepped forward, reaching out to touch the photo. The moment his fingers brushed against the paper, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A faint, high-pitched sound cut through the air. It was the unmistakable whine of a train's whistle. Jim turned quickly. There was nothing. The station was empty, just like it had been for years. But then, as if in answer to his question, a shadow flitted across the tracks, too quick for him to make out what it was. For a moment, he thought he saw something more. Someone. But when he blinked, it was gone. His heart began to race. It was time to find answers, time to face what had haunted him for all these years. Jim stood motionless, staring at the tracks where the shadow had passed. The air felt thick, as though the entire station was holding its breath. He glanced back at the photo, now trembling slightly in his hand, and a shiver ran down his spine. He hadn't realized how much guilt he had carried with him all these years. Not until this moment, standing in the place where it all went wrong. He forced himself to take a deep breath and step away from the wall. His heart was pounding in his chest, as if he had just run a marathon. He'd come to Katoen Station looking for answers, but already he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what he might find. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the letter, and looked at it once more. He still couldn't understand who could have sent it, but it didn't matter now. The letter was clear enough. It was a call for Jim to return. He had to figure out what had happened that day. He had to face Charlie's death and make sense of the things he'd buried for so long. The wind picked up again, and Jim shivered. He walked past the remnants of the old station house, the boards creaking beneath his boots, heading for the tracks. The place seemed frozen in time, yet so much had changed. What used to be a bustling train station was now just a ghost of its former self. Jim's eyes wandered across the platform, taking in the surrounding area. The train tracks stretched out in both directions, the rusted metal glinting dully in the fading sunlight. The familiar sights and smells of his youth seemed so distant now, replaced by a haunting emptiness that seemed to settle in the bones of the station itself. As he walked, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him from the shadows. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. A cold chill washed over him, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. The sound of a train's whistle cut through the air once again, clearer this time, closer. Jim's head snapped to the right, his heart racing. The tracks were empty. There was nothing there, but the sound was unmistakable. It was a real whistle, coming from a real train. He felt dizzy, disoriented, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Could he be imagining things? Was the isolation of this place finally getting to him? He turned in a circle, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Only the tracks, the wind, and the shadows of the station. He started to walk back to the platform where he had first seen the photo, when something caught his eye. There, in the corner of the platform, half hidden under the crumbling structure of the station house, was a set of old, rusted train tickets. They were scattered across the ground like forgotten relics. Jim knelt down and picked one up. It was torn and yellowed with age, but the dates were legible. The ticket was for the Katoen line, dated the day of the accident, the day Charlie had died. He could hardly believe it. The ticket wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just some piece of forgotten history. The accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been planned, orchestrated in some way that Jim couldn't understand. But the more he thought about it, the more he remembered how strange things had been that day. The odd sense of foreboding that had followed him, the warnings he had ignored. Had he really not seen the signs, or had he just chosen to look away? A voice broke through his thoughts. Jim. He froze. The voice was soft but clear, carrying with it an unmistakable familiarity. His heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. He turned quickly, but no one was there. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stood there, waiting. The voice had sounded like Charlie. He could almost hear the way Charlie would say his name, quick, as if he were trying to get Jim's attention. But there was no one, only the wind. "Charlie?" Jim whispered to the empty space, his voice cracking with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. But the wind didn't answer. Jim's knees felt weak, and he had to grab the nearest post to steady himself. His thoughts raced. This wasn't just a haunting, this was something far more sinister. Something that had been waiting all these years. "Charlie, I'm sorry," Jim murmured. his voice thick with regret. "I didn't. I couldn't." But as the words left his mouth, he heard it again, a faint, distant echo of a whistle. It was louder this time, closer. And then, for the briefest moment, Jim thought he saw it. A shadow moving along the tracks, taking form in the dying light of the day. The air seemed to grow colder still, and the sound of the train grew deafening. But when Jim looked again, there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something had just brushed past him, something he couldn't see but could certainly feel. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen on the platform, the wind tugging at his coat and the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The whistle, faint as it had been, still rang in his ears, like a haunting melody that wouldn't fade. He stumbled back toward the station house, each step heavy with doubt. His legs felt like lead, his hands trembling as he wiped them against his pants. This was madness, he thought. This had to be some kind of mental breakdown, a side effect of old age or the isolation of the station. But even as he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, he knew deep down that he wasn't alone. Not here, not now. Something had changed when he stepped back into Cato Station. Something he didn't fully understand. He needed answers. He had to know what had happened all those years ago. What had really caused the accident that claimed so many lives. The sun was nearly gone now, casting long, eerie shadows across the station. Jim didn't know why, but he felt the sudden urge to go inside the old station house. Maybe there, among the forgotten remnants of the past, he could find something that would explain the strange events unfolding around him. Something that would explain Charlie's voice, the whistle, the sense of being watched. As he entered the dimly lit room, the air inside was thick with dust. Cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling, and the old wood floor creaked beneath his weight. The room was abandoned, except for some rotting furniture and stacks of old paperwork, long forgotten by time. His eyes wandered over the detritus, landing on a small filing cabinet near the back wall. Jim had worked here, in this very room, all those years ago. This had been his office. He had spent hours upon hours sitting behind that very desk, filling out paperwork, scheduling train times, and chatting with the other workers. But it was the last thing he remembered doing before the crash, something he had pushed to the back of his mind. Until now. He walked over to the cabinet and pulled open one of the drawers. The rusted metal squealed as it gave way, revealing a collection of faded files. Jim shuffled through them absently, his fingers brushing over the decades-old papers until something caught his eye. A thick folder labeled Catoan Line Incident, 1983. His stomach tightened. That was the year of the crash. Jim's hands shook as he pulled the file out, flipping it open to reveal a stack of yellowed papers, handwritten reports and photographs. He scanned through the first few pages, most of it technical jargon about the derailment, speed limits, mechanical failure, and human error. But none of it felt right. None of it felt like the full story. Something was missing. He kept reading, his eyes narrowing as a name stood out. Charlie Webb. Jim's heart skipped a beat. Charlie had been part of the crew that day. But the report said something unexpected. Charlie had written a letter to his superiors just days before the accident, warning of irregularities on the tracks. The letter, in full, was included in the folder. Jim's hands trembled as he read the contents of the letter, Charlie's scroll filling the page. "There's something wrong at Cato Station. I don't know what it is, but I feel like something bad is coming. We've seen strange things, things that don't make sense. People are disappearing. I've been hearing things on the tracks at night, the whistle. It's not just the train, it's something else. I'm afraid we're being watched." Jim's breath hitched in his throat. His mind raced as he pieced together the fragments. Charlie had known. He had known something was wrong, something beyond mechanical failure or human error, something supernatural. And yet, Jim had dismissed it all back then, thinking it was just the ramblings of a man under stress. Now, as he stared at the letter, he felt the full weight of his failure. He flipped through the rest of the file, but his hands were shaking too much to focus. The last few pages were covered in strange symbols, nothing he recognized. His mind struggled to make sense of it all, and then he saw it. A photograph tucked in the back of the file. It was grainy, faded, but unmistakable. In the corner of the image stood Jim, looking much younger, and beside him was Charlie. They were standing in front of the train, a group of workers gathered around, but behind them, in the distance, Jim could see something that made his blood run cold. There, on the tracks, was a figure, tall, shadowy, and faintly glowing. At first, Jim thought it was just a trick of the light, a smear on the film. But then he realized it was there, and it wasn't just in the photograph. It was in his memory too, like a ghost lurking at the edge of his thoughts. Always present, but never seen. Jim slammed the file shut, his heart racing. He felt an overwhelming sense of nausea, like the very air in the room had thickened and was closing in on him. There was something wrong here, something deeply wrong. He turned to leave the station house, but as he stepped back into the fading light, he froze. The sound of a train whistle blasted in the distance, sharp and clear. But this time it wasn't the wind. This time, it was real. The tracks trembled beneath his feet, and then from the darkness beyond the station he saw it. The outline of a train, a shadow moving along the tracks, getting closer. Its headlights cut through the night like a predator's eyes, and for the briefest moment, Jim saw the figures inside, the faces of the lost, staring blankly out at him. His breath caught in his throat as the train neared. The figures inside were not real. They were ghostly, flickering in and out of existence, like the past itself had come alive. But just as the train came into view, it vanished. Jim stood alone, the station eerily quiet again, as if nothing had happened. And then, in the dead silence, he heard Charlie's voice once more, clear as day. "Jim, you have to stop it." The words echoed in Jim's mind, louder than the train whistle, louder than the wind. "You have to stop it." The voice sounded so real, so urgent that Jim couldn't ignore it. His legs felt weak beneath him, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there on the tracks. He took a step back from the platform, his eyes darting nervously around. The train had disappeared, vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. But the sensation lingered. Something was very wrong with Katoen Station, something far darker than any of the rumors he'd heard over the years. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about something older, something tied to the very land this station stood upon. Jim turned back toward the station house, as if the building itself might hold the answers. His mind raced. He had to keep searching. He had to uncover the truth before it was too late, before whatever had been haunting the station took him too. As he entered the dilapidated building, the familiar musty smell of old wood and dust filled his nostrils. The faint sound of the wind outside crept in through the cracks, but otherwise the station was silent. Too silent. Jim moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. He couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching him, that every shadow was hiding something. Someone. He reached the back of the station house again, where the filing cabinet had been, and scanned the room once more. His fingers brushed against the walls as he moved toward a door leading down to the station's basement. It was a small, narrow staircase, the air below thick with mildew and the smell of decay. Despite every instinct telling him to leave, Jim knew he couldn't walk away now. Not when the truth was so close. He had to face whatever was lurking down there, whatever had been waiting for him all these years. With a deep breath, Jim descended the steps, the sound of his boots on the old wood groaning under the weight. The basement was cold, far colder than the rest of the station, and the air felt heavier with each step. He reached the bottom and flipped the light switch, the weak bulb flickering as it illuminated the small space. Boxes and old equipment were stacked against the walls, covered in layers of dust, but it was the far corner of the basement that caught his eye. There in the dim light, Jim saw a large wooden crate partially open. It was out of place, too new for a place like this, too neatly arranged among the other old, forgotten items. His heart beat faster as he approached the crate. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo louder now, almost too loud. Something about the crate felt wrong, like it was calling to him. He pulled the lid open with a creak, and inside, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a collection of old, weathered train parts, wheels, brake pads, and bolts. But there was something more, something that shouldn't have been there. Among the train parts were old photographs, much like the one he'd found in the station house. But these were different. They were darker, more disturbing. The first photo was a close-up of a train track, but there, in the background, Jim could see a faint, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the platform. The figure was barely visible, but it was there, lurking in the background. The second photo was worse. It showed the same tracks, but this time the figure was closer, much closer, standing right beside the train, its face half hidden in shadow. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch out of proportion. Its features were blurred, but the one thing Jim could make out clearly were its eyes, deep, dark, and filled with malice. Jim's stomach twisted as he looked at the photo. He knew that figure. He had seen it before. That same shadowy form had been in the photograph from the file, the one from the day of the crash. It was the same figure standing behind him and Charlie. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a thought crossed his mind. The figure, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something much more sinister, a force, a presence that had been haunting Cato and Station for decades, maybe longer. His heart raced as he pulled the other photos from the crate. They were all similar, showing glimpses of the same tall figure lurking near the tracks, always just out of reach. It was as though the figure had been watching them all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, buried at the bottom of the crate, Jim found something that made his breath catch. It was a journal, old and brittle, the leather cover cracked with age. He opened it carefully, the pages crinkling under his fingers. The handwriting inside was neat, but it was filled with a sense of growing fear. It was Charlie's handwriting. I've seen it. The thing on the tracks. It's not just the station. It's something that was here before. I don't know how long it's been here, but it's not going to stop. It's watching us, and it's getting closer. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The journal entry continued, but the words blurred as a cold wind swept through the basement, extinguishing the weak light above him. The shadows seemed to deepen, closing in on him, and a chill ran through his bones. He could feel the presence again, that same sense of being watched. The whispering wind grew louder, almost as if it were speaking to him, urging him to listen. The train's whistle rang in his ears once more, only this time it wasn't distant. It was right there. "Jim," the voice whispered. It was Charlie's voice, but distorted, unnatural. "You have to stop it." The basement door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. The light flickered and then went out entirely, leaving Jim in total darkness. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled toward the stairs, but something stopped him, a shadow crossing the bottom of the stairs. It was that same figure, the one that had been haunting him all along. And now, it was here. Jim stumbled backward, his breath quick and shallow as the figure stepped into the dim light of the basement. Its eyes glowed faintly, a cold, malevolent light that seemed to pierce straight through him. "Charlie," Jim whispered, fear seeping into his voice. "What is this? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The train was coming. Jim's breath quickened as the figure drew closer. He couldn't see its face, but the eyes, those glowing, soulless eyes, burned into him like a brand. It wasn't Charlie. It couldn't be. But the presence was unmistakable. Jim had felt it before, lurking in the shadows, always just beyond his reach. The train's whistle blared again, loud and insistent, shaking the very foundations of the station. Jim's heart thudded in his chest, each beat like a drum echoing in the stillness. He backed away from the figure, his hands grasping for the door, but it was locked, the shadows inside the basement closing in around him like a trap. "You have to stop it," Charlie's voice echoed once more. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was urgent, desperate. The figure moved forward, its form growing clearer, more defined. Jim's mind raced. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was something older, something that had been tied to this place for far longer than he had known. The truth was unraveling before him, but he wasn't ready to face it. He wasn't sure he ever would be. But as the figure approached, Jim felt a wave of understanding wash over him. He didn't have time to deny it anymore. The train, the figure, the whispers, they were all part of something bigger, something that had been slowly pulling him in since the day of the crash. He took a deep breath and turned, facing the darkened basement with resolve. The figure had stopped moving. It stood silently, its eyes gleaming in the dark, waiting. "Charlie," Jim called out, his voice trembling but determined. "What are you trying to tell me? What happened that day?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the room around Jim began to shift. The shadows lengthened, twisting like smoke, and the walls seemed to close in. A low rumble echoed through the basement, like the sound of a train's wheels grinding against the tracks. For a moment, Jim thought he might lose his mind, the pressure of the space squeezing his thoughts until they fractured. But then, as if everything had aligned in that moment, he saw it. The image of the train. Not the one that had crashed in 1983, but the one that had been waiting all these years. A dark silhouette, a mass of writhing shadows and twisted metal. It was coming. No, it had always been coming. The accident had been no random tragedy. It had been a result of something far darker, something Jim hadn't yet fully understood. The journal had mentioned it. The train was the catalyst. The figure, the whispering presence. It was all part of a cycle that had been set in motion long before the crash. Jim had thought Charlie was the victim, but now he realized the truth. They all were. They had all been pulled into the same haunting, the same trap. And unless Jim did something, the cycle would continue. He looked at the figure, which seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. He could feel the weight of its gaze on him, like it was reading his very soul. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a force, a curse bound to the station and its tracks. "I understand," Jim said quietly. The words were barely a whisper, but they felt like the truth finally clicking into place. "You're not here to harm me. You're here to warn me." The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. Jim could feel the pressure in the air shift. The station was alive with energy, and it was all centered around him now. The train whistle sounded again, closer, sharper. "You want me to stop it?" Jim said, his voice growing steadier. "But how? How do I stop this?" The figure did not answer. It only took one more step toward him, its presence overwhelming. And as it did, Jim felt a strange pull, like gravity itself was shifting. He knew now that the figure, whatever it was the key to ending this nightmare. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The train was coming for him, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't a physical train. It was the culmination of everything that had happened here. The train was a symbol of the curse that had been cast on this station, and Jim knew he had to break the cycle before it was too late. With sudden clarity, Jim turned away from the figure and ran toward the stairs. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. He reached the basement door and shoved against it, the lock breaking with a loud snap. He burst out of the basement and into the night air, the cold wind whipping around him. But it wasn't enough to erase the sense of dread that clung to him. The sound of the train was still there, louder now, closer than ever. He had to act fast. Jim sprinted across the platform, his mind racing as he reached the tracks. The train was almost upon him, but he could hear the whispers growing louder now, swirling around him like a tempest. "Stop it, Jim!" Charlie's voice cried out, but this time it wasn't distorted. It was clear, full of pain and urgency. Jim knew what he had to do. He had to break the curse, to undo the chain of events that had led to this moment. He dropped to his knees on the tracks, pulling at the rusted metal beneath his fingers. The ground vibrated beneath him as the train grew ever closer, the figure's presence looming behind him like a dark shadow. Jim closed his eyes, gripping the tracks with all his strength. The whispers were deafening now, the cold air pressing in from all sides. "Please," Jim whispered. "I'm sorry. I'll make it right." And then, in a moment that felt like eternity, Jim felt the tracks give way beneath his hands. The darkness lifted, the whispers faded, and the pressure on his chest eased. The train stopped. For the first time in years, Jim was alone. The curse had been broken, and the shadows that had haunted Cato Station were gone. The silence that followed felt almost deafening. Jim lay on the ground next to the tracks, his hands trembling from the effort of what he had just done. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and for the first time since he'd stepped onto the platform at Cato Station, he didn't feel the oppressive weight of being watched. It was gone. The presence, the figure, the whispers, it was all gone. The train was no longer coming. The tracks were still, the once dominant rumbling of the steel wheels a distant memory. For a moment, Jim allowed himself to simply breathe, to absorb the peace that had settled around him. He could still feel the echo of the figure in the air, but it was fleeting, like the last remnants of a nightmare that fades with the dawn. The wind picked up, blowing through the empty platform, and Jim pushed himself to his feet, wiping the sweat from his brow. The station, which had once seemed so alive with energy, now felt abandoned, quiet, as though it too was finally at rest. The old wooden building in the distance loomed behind him, its windows dark and vacant. For the first time, the station felt like a place of closure rather than one of endless suffering. Jim turned, taking one last look at the tracks. The rusted steel glistened faintly under the moonlight, but it no longer held any menace. The accident that had claimed Charlie's life, the lives of others, had been set into motion by the curse of the station. And now, Jim had ended it. But the question lingered in his mind. Had he really undone everything? As he walked away from the tracks, Jim's thoughts turned to Charlie. He had felt his presence in the station, in the basement, even at the moment of the final confrontation. But had Charlie truly been a victim? Or had he been a part of the cycle, a part of the curse that had brought them both here? Jim didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. The burden of the station was over, and its haunted past was now just that, a past. As he reached the edge of the platform, he noticed a figure standing in the distance, near the station house. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a person, a woman, wearing an old-fashioned dress. Her back was to him, but he could see the faint outline of her long, flowing hair. Jim froze, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't alone after all. But as he took a step forward, the woman turned, and Jim gasped. It was Charlie's mother. He hadn't recognized her at first, but there was no mistaking the familiar features, the same sharp eyes, the same face. She had the same dark hair, the same thin frame. Jim's mind raced, and his legs began to move before he could stop them. "Mrs. Montgomery?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. The woman turned to him slowly, and Jim noticed that her expression was strangely calm, almost distant. She didn't seem shocked, didn't seem to acknowledge the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. There was something about her presence that felt otherworldly, timeless. "You were here," Jim said, taking a tentative step forward. I thought you left years ago." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I never left. None of us did. This place, it's a part of us, and it will always be." Jim felt his pulse quicken. He didn't understand what she meant, but he knew she wasn't just talking about the station. There was something deeper, something older to her words, something that stretched back before the crash, before even the station's construction. "You knew about the curse," Jim said, his voice thick with disbelief. Mrs. Montgomery's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jim saw a flicker of sadness in them. "I knew. I tried to stop it, but some things can't be stopped. They must be endured." "Endured?" Jim repeated. "You mean to say that we've all been a part of this? All of us who've come here?" She nodded once. "This station, it was built on something ancient, and that something has kept it alive. It feeds on the grief, the pain, the loss. The ones who die here, their souls don't leave. They stay, and they call others to join them. Jim's mind reeled. He had been part of this. He had fallen into the trap, the cycle of pain and death that had plagued Katoan Station for so long. "But I stopped it," Jim said almost to himself. "I ended it. The train is gone. The curse is over." Mrs. Montgomery's face remained unchanged. "You stopped one part of it, but there will always be others. The cycle will never truly end. It will only fade until it begins again." Jim stared at her, a chill creeping down his spine. The weight of her words settled on him, heavier than any shadow. He hadn't broken the cycle. He had only momentarily halted it. Katoan Station would always be a place of torment, a place where souls lingered, waiting for their turn to be claimed. "Goodbye, Jim," Mrs. Montgomery said softly. Her figure began to blur, fading into the night as if she had never been there at all. When Jim blinked, she was gone. Jim stood alone on the platform, the cold wind rustling through the trees in the distance. The station, silent and empty, seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. The curse hadn't been broken. It had simply been delayed. The train's whistle sounded once more, faint but persistent. Jim shuddered, the sound piercing his thoughts. Maybe it wasn't over after all. Story 3. The disappearance of the 4:30 a.m. express. Michael Lawson had always been a creature of habit. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., the alarm clock rang, its sharp sound cutting through the cold, quiet darkness of his small London apartment. A groan escaped his lips as he rubbed his eyes, struggling to shake off the remnants of sleep. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, his body moving almost automatically as he prepared for the same monotonous day that await a quick shower, a cup of coffee, and then he was off to catch the 4:30 a.m. express at the nearby station. The train was a necessary evil, a daily ritual that he had long since accepted as part of his life. Michael was a journalist, working at a small local newspaper, and the train was his connection to the world beyond his cramped office. The journey was uneventful, most mornings at least. The train was always nearly empty. The station was always deserted at this hour, save for a handful of commuters standing in line for the train. Michael wasn't a social person, so the solitude suited him just fine. He found comfort in the quiet, in the predictability of it all. The faint hum of the train, the sound of the station's dim lights buzzing overhead, the routine. He boarded the train without a second thought, taking his usual seat by the window. The carriage smelled faintly of dust, the fabric of the seats worn down by years of use. Michael glanced around. No one was ever really close. A few elderly passengers sat in the far corner, their eyes half-lidded as if they had long given up on the fort. The passengers around him, though present, seemed distant. Their faces were pale, their expressions vacant, as if they were trapped in their own worlds. He frowned. It wasn't that the passengers were unfriendly, but there was something off about them today. One woman, sitting a few seats away, stared blankly ahead. Her hands where Michael leaned back, trying to shake off the discomfort creeping up his spine. It was probably just a long night catching up with him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails and news up. He glanced out the window. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, but as the train moved farther away from the familiar streets, he noticed something odd. The buildings, small shops, apartments, and office buildings, looked different. The architecture was older, more worn, as though the city itself had aged in the brief time he had been. Michael shook his head. Maybe he was just tired. He took another glance at the time on his phone, noting how much longer the trip would take. The 4:30 a.m. express was always slow, but something about this particular morning felt wrong. As the train continued its journey, the hum of the tracks grew louder, and a soft whisper of unease began to settle deep in Michael's chest. The minutes ticked by slowly as the train sped along its route, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks offering a faint sense of comfort. Michael tried to dismiss the unease he felt creeping up on him, attributing it to the early hour and the lack of sleep. But as he glanced around the cabin, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was off. The passengers remained as distant as ever, But now, they seemed even more disconnected. Their faces were pale, their expressions absent, as if they were no longer fully aware of their surroundings. Michael looked at the elderly man across the aisle, his hands trembling slightly as he held a newspaper, but his eyes unfocused. The woman a few rows ahead continued to stare blankly out of the window, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though caught in some invisible trance. The eerie silence that enveloped the train seemed to weigh on him. Michael tried to shake off the unsettling feeling by pulling out his book, but the pages blurred in front of him. The low hum of the train had grown louder, almost like an oppressive presence that filled the space. He could feel his heartbeat quicken as he looked at the other passengers, hoping for some sign that they were all just tired, that nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But it was hard to ignore the growing tension in the air. As the train continued its journey, Michael noticed something else. Something that seemed too subtle at first, but became impossible to ignore as time passed. The air around him had grown colder, a strange chill that prickled his skin and sent shivers down his spine, despite the heat in the cabin. His breath fogged slightly as he exhaled, and he glanced at the elderly woman seated near the door. She didn't even seem to notice, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, her lips moving in what looked like a quiet prayer. He rubbed his arms, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in his stomach. His eyes flicked to the windows again, and this time he noticed that the familiar buildings outside had begun to blur into something unfamiliar. The cityscape seemed to dissolve as the train moved further away from the heart of London. The buildings became older, the streets more desolate. It wasn't just the architecture, it was the way the scenery seemed to warp and change before his very eyes. Michael's pulse quickened. He glanced nervously at his watch, which read 4:47 a.m. The train was supposed to be a 30-minute journey to his stop, but the scenery, it didn't look right. The familiar landmarks that should have been passing by had vanished. He was no longer sure of where he was. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden screech of the train's brakes. The sharp noise sliced through the air, making everyone in the carriage jump. Michael's heart raced, his instincts telling him something was terribly wrong. The train slowly came to a halt in the middle of what appeared to be an empty field. There were no station signs, no other trains in sight, just empty tracks stretching out into the mist. The lights in the carriage flickered, then went out completely for a moment, leaving them in eerie darkness. For a split second, Michael's phone screen illuminated the cabin with its faint glow, but the moment the lights returned, the strange scene outside remained unchanged. It was as if the train was no longer on its original route, as if it had crossed into a different world entirely. A woman across the aisle coughed softly, breaking the silence. But when Michael looked at her, she was staring at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't smile. There was no recognition. It was as if she didn't see him at all. The moment was uncomfortable, like being observed by someone who wasn't entirely human. As the train began to move again, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His thoughts raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Was he dreaming? Had he fallen asleep on the train? But as the train continued its journey, he knew, deep down, that there was no rational explanation for the bizarre scene unfolding around him. He glanced out the window again, but now the world outside seemed to shift, the landscape morphing in front of him. The mist had thickened, and the buildings that appeared now were old, abandoned, and decayed. The tracks beneath the train creaked, a sound so haunting that it almost felt like the train itself was alive, its movements deliberate and sinister. Michael's hand trembled as he placed it on the armrest, the weight of dread settling heavily in his chest. The train had become a vessel, carrying him further into the unknown. And despite his growing sense of panic, there was nothing he could do to escape. The passengers, still silent, continued to sit as if nothing was amiss, but Michael knew better. He was no longer sure where he was, or even who he was anymore. The 4:30 a.m. express had taken him somewhere he couldn't follow. The train rolled on, its eerie motion unbroken despite the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in Michael's chest. He couldn't shake the sense that the world outside had turned strange, distorted in a way that didn't make sense. The landscape beyond the window appeared to be stuck in time, with fog creeping across the tracks and buildings that looked like they belonged in a forgotten century. Michael's hands gripped the armrest tighter, his knuckles white. The cold was unbearable now, seeping through his jacket as though the train was drawing its chill directly from the air. He tried to breathe steadily, to reassure himself that it was just his mind playing tricks. But the train had stopped in the middle of nowhere, and no one seemed concerned. As his gaze flicked across the carriage, he saw something that made his stomach drop, a realization that sent a cold sweat running down his spine. The passengers who had been there when he first boarded were no longer in their seats. The elderly man who had been sitting across from him was gone. The woman with the blank stare, the one who hadn't noticed him at all, she was nowhere to be found either. In their place, empty seats remained, the silence growing louder, more oppressive with each passing second. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had gotten off at the last station, but then why hadn't he seen them leave? The train had been stationary for too long, and he had been watching the other passengers closely. They hadn't moved. Michael's breath quickened as he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. He walked toward the nearest door, pushing through the dim light of the cabin as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The faint rustling of his feet against the carpet was the only sound, echoing in the vast emptiness of the train. When he reached the door, he placed a trembling hand on the handle, trying to pull it open. The door remained shut, the metal cold and unyielding. He tugged harder, but there was no give. Desperation started to set in, and his mind raced, thinking of escape routes, but he found none. His only option was to return to his seat, to wait for something, anything, that could explain this madness. He glanced over his shoulder, and that's when he saw it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, a blur of movement. But as his eyes adjusted to the dimness of the carriage, the figure became clearer, closer. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair long and wild, her face obscured by a veil. She was standing near the farthest corner of the train, completely still. Michael's heart raced as he took a tentative step forward. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get away from whatever this was, but his legs betrayed him. He couldn't move. The woman remained motionless, her head slightly tilted as if she were studying him from behind her veil. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he realized that she was staring directly at him. His thoughts were cut off by a sudden, sharp jolt that shook the entire train, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The woman in the corner disappeared. The seats were suddenly filled again, this time by figures that seemed unfamiliar. Their features were obscured in shadow, and their eyes were black, empty pits of darkness that pierced through him. Michael stumbled backward, his chest tightening with panic. What was happening to him? Was he going insane? How could the people have vanished so quickly? The train moved again, but the change in scenery was even more alarming now. The mist outside had thickened to the point where it seemed to swallow the train whole, and the dark silhouettes of abandoned buildings loomed on either side. He turned back to the cabin. The new passengers were silent, unnaturally still, their faces turned toward him but not in acknowledgement. There was no sound, no movement, just those unblinking, lifeless eyes staring at him from every direction. A cold chill washed over him as he looked around. How had the train become so full? The seats were packed with people now, and their unnatural stillness filled the cabin with an oppressive air, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The light above flickered, and the train's low hum had become a constant drone, louder than it had been before. The doors, still locked, kept him trapped inside with these strange figures. A sense of dread crawled under his skin. He pressed his back against the wall and slowly slid down to the floor, hugging his knees as the weight of the situation sank in. The woman from earlier, the one in the white dress, had reappeared, standing at the end of the carriage now. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her presence felt like a warning, a signal of something much darker at play. Michael could hear the faintest whispers, like voices in the distance, but they were incomprehensible, muttering something in a language he couldn't place. He closed his eyes, hoping to wake up to find himself back in his apartment, safe and sound. But when he opened them, the figure in the corner was still there, watching, waiting. The train rattled along, its journey endless. Michael wasn't sure how long he had been on board, how much longer he could endure the strange silence and the suffocating atmosphere. All he knew was that this train, with its vanishing passengers and haunting presence, was no longer just a way to get from one place to another. It had become a trap, a place where reality no longer existed, and time itself seemed to bend to some otherworldly will, and he was trapped inside it. The train continued to move at a steady pace, yet Michael felt as though time itself had lost all meaning. He glanced at his watch again. 4:58 a.m. He had no idea if that was accurate anymore. He had no idea where he was or if the hours had even passed since the train first began its journey. His mind was racing, struggling to keep track of reality as it twisted and bent around him. The passengers in the carriage, their faces ashen and eyes void of emotion, seemed to have taken on an almost ghostly quality. They were not alive in any meaningful sense, more like hollow shells, bodies that had long since given up any hope of being real. Yet there they sat, motionless, as if waiting for something. Michael tried not to look at them too long, afraid that their gaze would turn toward him, that their dark, empty eyes would somehow claim him too, turn him into one of them. Then he heard it again, whispers, soft, almost imperceptible yet unmistakable. They were coming from the shadows at the end of the carriage where the woman in the white dress had stood. Michael's breath hitched as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. He could catch only snippets of words, but they sent an icy chill down his spine. Leave. Before. It's too late. Not alone. He jerked his head toward the sound, his heart pounding. The woman in the white dress was still there, standing at the end of the carriage, her back to him. But now, her long, unkempt hair moved as though caught in an invisible wind, swirling around her in unnatural patterns. Her figure seemed to flicker like a faulty image on a TV screen, her outline distorting in and out of focus. She wasn't just a ghost. She was something other, something that didn't belong here. Michael's legs were frozen in place, unable to move as he stared at her. But it wasn't just her that held his attention now. It was the dark figure next to her, a shadowy silhouette of a man whose face remained hidden, though his presence felt as though it stretched across the entire cabin. The shadow seemed to pulse, undulating like the very air around it was alive. The whispers intensified, now almost deafening in their urgency. Michael couldn't understand the full meaning, but he could sense one thing. The woman and the shadow were trying to tell him something vital. Leave. Leave now. The words came through clearly now, almost a command. Michael's body surged forward on its own, driven by the primal instinct to escape. He didn't even know where he was going, or what he hoped to accomplish, but he was sure he had to leave this carriage, to find a way out of this nightmare. He stumbled down the aisle, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. The other passengers remained unmoving, their eyes still locked forward, as though they didn't see him or the woman, or perhaps they couldn't see them at all. But as Michael neared the door to the next carriage, the train lurched again, a sudden jolt that sent him sprawling forward onto the floor. His palms scraped against the cold metal floor as he pushed himself back up, eyes wide in terror. He tried the door. It was locked, just like all the others. His mind raced as he frantically tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation clawed at him. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a sense of suffocating dread. Michael turned back toward the front of the carriage, and that's when he saw it. The woman in the white dress was standing just behind him now, her presence looming over him like a dark cloud. Her hand reached out toward him, slow and deliberate, and in her other hand, she held something, an old, worn notebook. For a moment, Michael thought he was hallucinating. His thoughts scrambled as he backed away from her, but his legs felt weak, as though the very air had turned to lead. The woman's eyes, hidden behind the veil, seemed to gleam with something he couldn't quite grasp. Then she held the notebook out to him. the pages stained and crinkled from age. "Take it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shrieking wind that had suddenly started to howl through the cabin. He reached for the notebook, his fingers trembling as they brushed against its brittle cover. The moment his hand made contact with it, a strange jolt of energy surged through his body, sending a shockwave of cold through his spine. The woman's hand withdrew, and Michael found himself holding the notebook in his lap. Before he could fully process what had just happened, a loud crash erupted from the front of the train. The sound of shattering glass and metal scraping against metal echoed through the carriage. Michael's head snapped toward the front, eyes widening in fear. The figure in the shadows had moved closer. The man was standing now, his face still hidden, but his presence felt more tangible than ever. He was no longer just a shadow. He was real. Too real. "Get off," a voice hissed from the darkness. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, filled with malice. "You shouldn't have taken it." The train lurched again, harder this time, as if the very tracks beneath it were cracking. The lights flickered and dimmed, and for a brief moment, everything was plunged into darkness. Michael's heart stopped as he gripped the notebook in his hands. The whispers, the warning, the shadow, it was all connected. This train was a trap, a place where the living and the dead intertwined, and there was no way out. He had taken something that had already been lost, something that had broken the balance. And now, there was no going back. The air inside the train had grown unbearably thick, as if each breath Michael took was laced with the cold, oppressive weight of the shadows closing in around him. His hands shook as he gripped the notebook, the edges of its pages brittle beneath his fingertips. The strange energy it pulsed with seemed to infect his very thoughts, clouding his mind and drowning out everything but a single, overwhelming sense of dread. The train's screeching noise grew louder, drowning out everything else as the wheels rumbled against the tracks in a rhythmic frenzy. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and the entire cabin plunged into darkness. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the rattling of the train, but something was different now. The faint whispers he had been hearing earlier were no longer distant. They were all around him, suffocating him. They crawled under his skin, burrowing into his mind, their words urgent and demanding. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have taken it." A cold wind swept through the cabin, its icy fingers creeping across his skin. Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out. He pressed his back against the cold wall, his breath ragged as the darkness pressed in on him. There was no escaping the sense that the train itself was alive, as though the very metal and wood of the carriage were conspiring against him. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, but everything was different. The train, which had once been empty and barren, was now filled with the most grotesque figures Michael had ever seen. The passengers from before had all returned, but they were no longer the same. Their eyes were dark voids, their skin pale and cracked, and their movements jerky and unnatural. They stared at him with dead, hollow eyes, their lips curled into sinister smiles. There was something deeply unsettling about their faces, a cold, predatory gleam that sent a shiver down his spine. But it wasn't just their appearance that terrified him. It was the overwhelming sense of wrongness that seemed to radiate from every corner of the train, from every passenger. They were all staring at him now, their gazes locked on him as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to understand. He could feel the shadow of the figure standing at the far end of the carriage, the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching him, waiting for him to break. Michael glanced down at the notebook in his hands, but the writing on the pages had changed. It was no longer the same text he had seen when he first opened it. Now, the pages were filled with strange symbols and warnings, cryptic phrases in languages he didn't understand, but somehow they still made sense. "It's too late. It's never been just a train. It's a passage." The words seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. It was as if the notebook itself was alive, its contents constantly changing, revealing more horrifying truths with each passing moment. "Get off." The voice from the shadowy figure was louder now, closer. Michael's eyes snapped up, and there, standing directly in front of him, was the woman in the white dress once again. She was no longer distant, no longer ethereal. She was right there, standing just a few feet away, her face obscured by the veil that fluttered in an unseen wind. Her presence felt suffocating, as though every breath he took was being stolen from him. "This isn't your destination." The woman's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife, sending a wave of terror crashing over Michael. He stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The train had stopped moving, and the silence that followed was absolute, deafening. The woman raised her hand slowly, and in that instant, the doors to the carriage slammed shut with a violent force. The walls of the train seemed to close in on Michael, the air thickening until it felt as though it were pressing against his chest, suffocating him. Then, the woman spoke again, but this time, her voice was not alone. "There is no escape. The station is your end." The lights flickered once more, casting the carriage into a flickering, broken half-light. In that moment, Michael realized something chilling. They weren't moving forward anymore. The train was no longer following its predetermined route. Instead, it had stalled at a station that didn't exist on any map. Through the mist outside the train's window, Michael saw something. A station looming like an ancient fortress. The stone pillars stood tall and imposing, their surfaces weathered and cracked, as though time itself had forgotten about this place. The train seemed to be drawn toward it, as if it had no choice but to follow its inevitable course. The station was a trap, and Michael was its prey. "This is Catoan Station." The words echoed in his mind, and as he looked around the train, he saw the passengers, the once lifeless figures, begin to stir. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and unnatural, as though they were waking from a deep slumber. Their eyes locked onto Michael, and they began to move toward him, their footsteps silent but heavy. The woman's voice whispered again, but now it was a command. "Get off now, before it's too late." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that this was the end. Catoan Station wasn't just a stop. It was the place where lost souls came to rest. It was the final destination for those who had boarded the train, the place where they were doomed to remain, trapped in time forever. And now, Michael was one of them. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears as the suffocating atmosphere of the train closed in on him. His body was frozen in place, gripped by a terror that went beyond fear. It was as though his very soul had been ensnared in something far older, far darker than he could comprehend. The passengers, now fully awake and moving toward him, had stopped smiling. Their faces were twisted into grotesque masks of hunger and malice, their eyes wide and vacant, as though they had no past or future, only an endless gnawing present. As the woman in the white dress took a slow step forward, Michael felt the temperature plummet, his breath becoming visible in the frigid air. Her presence was overwhelming now. Her eyes, those eyes that had been hidden behind the veil, were now exposed, and what he saw nearly shattered his mind. Her pupils were unnaturally large, black as ink, swallowing everything in their path. Her skin was as pale as death, and her lips were twisted into a thin line of something that could have been either sorrow or fury. But it was her voice that clawed at Michael's sanity. It was soft, almost soothing, but carrying an unbearable weight of inevitability. "You're too late." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like a gong. Michael staggered back, his hands trembling violently as he tried to cling to some shred of rational thought. But there was none to be found. There was only the train, and the relentless pull toward Catoan Station, the place that now seemed to pulse with an unseen force, drawing everything and everyone into its grasp. Suddenly the train lurched again, this time with an unnatural jolt that knocked Michael to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he tried to understand what was happening. The shadows that had surrounded him, the figures in the distance, the cryptic whispers, it was all coming to a head. The door at the back of the carriage swung open with an eerie creak, as if beckoning him to enter the unknown. He looked around in desperation, hoping for an escape. But the shadows in the corner of the cabin, the very ones that had stalked him from the moment he first set foot on this cursed train, were now moving toward him, stretching toward him like limbs of darkness. "No!" he shouted at the woman, at the passengers, at the shadows themselves. But the sound of his voice was swallowed whole by the train's engine, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the walls of the carriage. The train had taken on a life of its own now. It wasn't just a mode of transport. It was a portal, a vessel for something far darker. And Michael was no longer just a passenger. He was its prey. The doors at the rear of the carriage opened wide, and Michael knew instinctively that there was no choice now. The station, the one he had glimpsed through the mist outside, was no longer just a place. It was a living entity, and it had come for him. Michael took a tentative step toward the exit, but the train seemed to resist. The air around him grew thick, as though the very atmosphere was pushing against him, trying to drag him back into the bowels of the train. He could hear the faint cries of the passengers, their voices rising in unison, pleading, crying out for something he could not understand. They were lost, trapped in time, and now they were beckoning him to join them. "It's not your time. You're not ready." The words were a warning, but they were also a threat. The woman's voice seemed to come from all directions, a spectral presence enveloping him. He looked back at the shadows. Their faces were closer now, their eyes empty and waiting. He knew now what they were. They weren't passengers. They were the lost souls, those who had boarded the train before him, and now their journey had ended. A cold, clammy hand brushed his shoulder, and Michael spun around to find himself face to face with the shadowy figure of the man who had been following him. His face was still hidden, but Michael could feel his eyes on him, probing him. The man was not alive, not in any sense that Michael understood. He was just a fragment of something ancient, a presence that lived beyond death. His cold, skeletal hand gripped Michael's arm, pulling him closer to the door. Michael tried to break free, but the shadow's grip was unyielding. He struggled, his heart racing, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though the weight of the station had begun to settle in his bones. "You don't have a choice." The words were the final straw. Michael realized with chilling clarity that this was it. The train had taken him to Katoen station, and there was no escape. There was no running. He had been drawn into this place, and now he was part of it. The souls aboard the train, the lost souls who had all vanished before him, they weren't just passengers. They were part of the station now. And soon, Michael would join them, forgotten and trapped in this endless loop of despair. The train let out a low, mournful wail, and the last of the mist outside seemed to reach into the cabin, swirling around Michael as he was pulled through the open door. The air outside the train was thick with the damp mist that hung like a suffocating veil over Katoen station. Michael couldn't breathe. The train's screeching noise still reverberated in his ears, though it had stopped moving. His body felt light, as though he were drifting, unable to ground himself in the reality that once seemed so certain. He stood, rooted to the platform, unable to look away from the looming figure that stood at the heart of Katoen station. The train doors had closed behind him, trapping him in this ethereal space, and the world around him felt wrong. The air was stale and thick, every breath a struggle. The mist rolled across the cracked stone platform, curling like tendrils, its touch like ice against his skin. The station's structure appeared to be ancient, the stone walls blackened and eroded by time. It felt as though time itself had no meaning here, as though everything was suspended in an eternal moment of decay. He couldn't remember how he had gotten off the train. One moment, he had been standing inside, the weight of the train's oppressive energy crushing him, and the next, he was here, on the platform, facing the abyss that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the station. And the whispers, they were louder now. There was no escape from them. They crawled through his mind, feeding him thoughts, memories, and feelings that didn't belong to him. The station itself seemed to pulse with them as if it were alive. No, more than alive. The whispers were the essence of the place, of the souls that had passed through here and never left. They were the voices of those who had boarded the train before him, and now they were merging with him, becoming part of his soul. The woman in the white dress appeared once again, standing just at the edge of his vision, her form like a mirage. The veil fluttered in the same invisible wind, her eyes dark and empty, but this time, her face was no longer just an image of warning. It was a part of him now. She stepped closer, and her presence was suffocating. As she reached for him, Michael could feel her cold fingers brush against his arm, sending a shock of ice through his veins. His knees buckled and he dropped to the ground, clutching his chest as if he were suffocating. "It's too late for you." Her voice, though soft, seemed to penetrate into his very core, vibrating through his bones. The air seemed to thicken around him, the walls of the station closing in, squeezing the life out of him. He looked up, but it was too late. His vision began to blur as the whispers crescendoed into a maddening cacophony, the sound like thousands of voices pleading for salvation, for a release that would never come. Michael tried to stand, tried to escape, but the ground beneath him seemed to move with a life of its own, dragging him toward the center of the platform, where an eerie, blinding light shone from beneath the station floor. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was choking, gasping for air, but the mist had filled his lungs, suffocating him from the inside. Around him, the silhouettes of the other lost souls began to form. Hazy, indistinct shapes moving toward him from the shadows of the station. They were all looking at him, waiting, their hollow eyes wide, their hands reaching out in a desperate, silent plea. But it was no use. They were all trapped here, just like him, forever. "Welcome to your final stop." The words echoed in his mind, and with them, Michael understood. Katoan Station wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a place where souls were trapped, never allowed to pass on. The train was the vessel that brought them all here, and now he was just another fragment of its eternal journey. The station was its own kind of purgatory, a waiting room for the lost, where time had no meaning, and the future was a cruel illusion. As the last remnants of his consciousness began to fade, Michael felt his body sinking into the mist, his limbs growing heavy and numb. The lost souls, now indistinguishable from the shadows, surrounded him. He felt their cold touch, their silent wails filling his mind as he was pulled deeper into the abyss. His body was no longer his own. It was as though his soul was being devoured by the station itself, absorbed into its never-ending web. In his final moments, Michael realized the truth he had tried to deny. There was no escape from Katoan Station. No one left once they arrived. The train, the whispers, the shadows, they were all part of a cruel cycle that had begun long before him, and it would continue long after. And so, as Michael's body vanished into the mist, he became another lost soul, another whisper among the endless chorus that haunted Katoan Station.